Welcome to the 38th Annual Norman Glickman Lecture in Urban Studies. I'm Elaine Simon, the Urban Studies Program Co-Director, with David Grazian, Professor of Sociology at Penn and the program's Faculty Director. This year's event is a bit of a departure from the past in that we have a panel that will take up the themes of our featured author, Eric C. Schneider, in his book, The Ecology of Homicide, Race, Space, and Place in Post-War Philadelphia. Eric passed away in the spring of 2017 while he was working on this book. Fortunately, his friend and colleague, Howard Gillette Jr, was able to bring the manuscript to publication and will serve as speaker and moderator for the panel today. Eric Schneider had deep connections to the Urban Studies program. He was Associate Director for Academic Affairs and Adjunct Professor of History in the School of Arts and Sciences. But he also taught in the Urban Studies program for 30 years. The Ecology of Homicide is the last in a series of books he wrote, animating criminal justice issues, delinquency, drugs, gangs, and murder, depicting how these activities were shaped by and in turn shaped the American city. His previous books, Smack, Heroin, and the American City won the Urban History Association's Kenneth Jackson Best Book Award in 2008. Howard Gillette Jr, who will moderate the panel, is Emeritus Professor of History at Rutgers University, Camden. He's co-editor of the online Encyclopedia of Greater Philadelphia and author of multiple books, most recently, The Paradox of Urban Revitalization, Progress and Poverty in America's Post-Industrial Era, forthcoming from Penn Press. He also taught the Penn Urban Studies course, The Transformation of Urban America. The panel brings together another historian of the American city, a criminal justice activist, and a criminal justice scholar to address the book's themes in light of today's crisis, both in Philadelphia and in other cities. I want to make a note that after the panel presentations, David Grazian will moderate the Q&A. So write your questions in the Q&A slot on the Zoom screen. The lecture has both pedagogical and public purposes for urban studies. The lecture is part of the Urban Studies Senior Seminar, a course Eric taught for 30 years. Eric loved teaching the senior seminar, and his students loved Eric with his tough love approach. His connection with the seminar is another way in which this annual lecture is special this year, and I hope honors Eric's memory. The students in the seminar engage with the work of an eminent scholar as a kind of model as they carry out their own research projects. We have an opportunity to ask questions that come up in the class discussions during a special noontime seminar with the speaker, in this case, Howard Gillette, earlier today, which reveals something of the motivations and struggles faced by researchers, and in this case, also faced by a steward of Eric Schneider's writing. In addition, for the Urban Studies program, the annual lecture is our most public event, and we always try to reach audiences outside of the university as well as within. We draw on our connections to city government and the nonprofit sector in Philadelphia. The lecture is made possible by a generous contribution from the program's founder, Norman Glickman, his wife Elise Pivnik, and Urban Studies alum William Whitty. Norm was an urban economist who taught at Penn, the University of Texas, Austin, and Rutgers University, where he founded the Center for Urban Policy Research. I also want to acknowledge Vicki Karkoff, who's Urban Studies program coordinator, who's pulled all of the pieces together to make this event possible. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Howard.
Thank you, Elaine. I'm very glad to be a part of this program tonight, and I very much appreciate the fact that you and your colleagues are honoring Eric with this presentation. I also want to thank Jenna Golden, his widow, for asking me to complete the book, and to Bob Lockhart at Penn Press for helping bring it to publication so we can all take advantage of his research and thinking. I have prepared some remarks ahead of time, which I circulate to the panel so they knew what we were going to do, and I will be reading them tonight. Not my preference generally, but I'm going to do that so that we all are on the same page. And then I will introduce briefly each of the three panelists who will speak for about 10 minutes apiece. Now, Eric, as Elaine has already suggested, like to describe his work as examining the dark side of history. The author of previous books on crack cocaine and gangs in New York, his study of murder in Philadelphia is no less difficult in its subject matter. Looking at the way murder was both racialized and spatialized, he confronts an issue central not just to the period following World War II, but today. The overwhelming number of fatalities were Black, the victims most immediately of other Black people. Black on Black violence, he admits, is a controversial topic, not the least when addressed by a white man. But social problems cannot be solved, he asserts, through silence. And the data about murder are incontrovertible. Biases abound in the criminal justice process and therefore in criminal justice statistics. But biases do not produce bodies, murderers do. Going beyond statistics, Schneider takes us into the lives of those involved by mining the trials of convicted murderers. As he does so, a picture emerges of the world in which violence could erupt at any moment between friends and acquaintances, between spouses, between lovers. Rarely did such occasions arise through intentional acts of crime, the kind of events that made their way into headlines, especially when the victims were white. Schneider recounts the many theories that have formed to explain such acts, among them one that prevailed in an earlier era of scholarship, advanced by Penn professor Marvin Wolfgang, a subculture of violence determined by norms alien to common safety and respect, amplified over the years by a perception that Blacks who arrived in Philadelphia as part of the Great Migration from the South brought with them a culture of violence bred in the hostile world they were coming from. The explanation has lived on well beyond the time of that process. Schneider rejects that theory, following the lead of sociologists William Julius Wilson and Robert Sampson, who have stressed prevailing social and environmental factors fostering violence. Ghettoization, not migration, Schneider contends, created an environment, an ecology, which could trigger violence in multiple circumstances. It's through the stories that Schneider tells that we see one friend killing another over his unwillingness to pick up the tab for a drink, or a man killing his wife to defend his manhood against threats of spousal, financial, or romantic independence. Such acts, he suggests, are the product not of innate characteristic traits, but of environment. Even as America prospered after World War II, those confined to declining neighborhoods, most notably in North and West Philadelphia, lived precariously. And because they did, men carried weapons. In the early years, knives, and by the mid-1960s, guns, which they used to protect themselves both physically and emotionally, often with fatal results. Schneider's not a determinist. He recognizes in the lives he recounts a level of agency to determine their own fate. But these are lives circumscribed by elements we can readily recognize. Most notably, this is a world in which Blacks are underprotected and threats materialized and over-policed through what Schneider calls the force's dirty work, performing tasks that mainstream society wants done, but does not wish to recognize. This involved all sorts of intrusiveness in forms we recognize today, in relentless interrogations, the so-called third degree, through rough rides to the police station, and here we can think of Freddie Gray in Baltimore, and dropping gang members often after arrests in neighborhoods hostile to them, known as turf dropping. This was a situation that the late scholar William Schultz described as, quote, poor Black neighborhoods seeing too little of the kinds of policing and criminal punishment that do the most good, and too much of the kinds that do harm. In a chapter that has special relevance today, Schneider details in an admirable but ineffective way the liberal lines of reform Joseph Clark and Richardson Dilworth tried to provide oversight of the police by forming in 1958 the first civilian review board in the country. Lacking formal authorization from city council, the board tried futilely to investigate and act upon the many complaints Black residents raised about their treatment by law enforcement personnel. Over time, activists discouraged even submitting complaints, given the unlikeliness that they would lead anywhere. Other institutions also failed the Black community, including the University of Pennsylvania. Responding to the murder just off campus, also in 1958, of Korean graduate student In Oh Ho, Penn acted to better secure its borders. Going well beyond beefing up its own police presence, the university used its inside connections with the Planning Commission to advance an urban renewal plan that managed to transform an entire Black community nearby, known as Black Bottom, into what we now recognize as University City. The resulting displacement meant the loss of yet another Black community on the way to what was often called urban revitalization. Against the failures of various public authorities and institutions, Schneider recalls some of the more successful interventions, especially as they related to gang violence. These were homegrown initiatives, born of the tragedies that flowed from sustained violence that permeated the ghetto. Among these was David and Falaka Fatah's House of Umoja in West Philadelphia, and Mothers Concerned in North Philadelphia. Through sustained efforts, peace treaties between gangs were drawn and maintained, at least for a while. The conditions that fostered violence, concentrated poverty sustained by pervasive institutional racism did not change. But for a while, some measure of stability prevailed. The last chapter of the book was never completed. From the little we know, Schneider was pointing to the emergence of an organized drug trade and its effects. Ghettos had always been characterized by what Chicago sociologists called business under a cloud, nonviolent violations of the law to keep the underground economy running, most notably the numbers trade. The convergence of readily available guns and drugs, notably cocaine, with deindustrialization and with ongoing bias in policing, ignited quite another kind of crisis, one that we're still dealing with. Schneider's story ends in the 1980s, and lacking that last chapter, he doesn't connect his assessment directly to the present. But he was clearly drawn to the subject through contemporary observation. News reports today seldom convey the life experiences, either of the victims or the perpetrators of murder. Yet the material world of concentrated poverty and its policing, both formally and informally, remain. What Schneider has done is to provide vivid insight into the life experiences that resulted in so many tragedies. If he didn't provide a prescription for a contemporary crisis, he nonetheless underscored its urgency. And my hope is that our panelists will use this account as a spark for further insight into this deeply troubling aspect of the modern city, past and present. Now, with that opening comment, I'm going to turn now to our first panelist, fellow historian, Lisa Keller, who is professor of history at SUNY Purchase. Lisa is well known for her heroic efforts to bring 2 editions of the New York Encyclopedia to press, and is also the author of the important book, Democracy in Public Space in New York and London. Lisa, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Howard. I'm very grateful to be here and provide this tribute to Eric, not just a typical academic tribute, but a very personal tribute in terms of Howard's role in this entire field. I came to know Howard, and I think some of my personal comments are important in understanding what I have to say. I came to know Howard through the seminar on the city at Columbia, which I'm chair of. Eric had presented work. Scholars present works in progress, and Eric had presented SMAC a number of years earlier, and then I came to know him very well, and then invited him back to present on this book that he was working on. He called me up at a certain point. I schedule things quite a bit in advance. And he called me up in what was one of the most heartbreaking conversations I have ever had with anyone. And he told me his health was poor and he didn't know what the prognosis would be. And we talked about whether or not we should continue having him on the program for the seminar in the city. And while part of me wanted to say, well, maybe it would be better if you canceled it, I got a sense from him that he didn't want to do it. So I said, look, why don't we keep it on the calendar and proceed, and whatever happens, happen. And he said to me, I'm so glad you said that, because it is giving me the will to push on. And he did push on as much as he could. And he didn't make it to the presentation, but we did have it, and a huge thanks goes to Howard. I don't think, and I'm sure everyone knows what Howard Gillette has done for this book, but there are very few people who would have devoted this much time and effort to a colleague and really not get as much credit as the person who was writing the book. And it took a lot of work to get the book to fruition. The book itself is an incredible work in a lot of ways. What attracted me to the book was not what we conventionally reference. His intellectual and scholarly abilities were a given. He was meticulous in his research. There's no doubt about it. I had enough conversations. He was immersed in it. I think that SMAC was the preview to this book, The Ecology of Homicide. And I think in many ways, SMAC accounted for his ability to write The Ecology of Homicide, because in many ways, the book is really the humanity of homicide. One of the things that Eric does that scholars very often don't do, they give you figures, they give you facts, they tell you about legal systems, but Eric gives us an interior view of the people who are involved. This is not a biased view, it's not pitying, it's a view of what lives are like for people in these circumstances. And for this, it is truly a tribute to how a scholar can reach out, cross audiences, and convey a sense of his subjects without looking down on them in any particular way. It presents searing voices of his subjects. Eric let the subjects speak for themselves. He tried not to alter it. The drama was incredible of what these subjects said. And because of this drama, the work became very engaging. It was not easy at this presentation at the city seminar. I have never had a posthumous presentation of a work in progress before. And I know that Howard was very keen to hear what the scholars at the seminar had to say. And fortunately, the scholars basically all agreed that this work needed to be published. It presented something that was very important in asserting voices of people who are not often heard. Had Eric been able to finish the book, we speculated, as I recall, what would have happened in the last chapter. I don't know, but I think what he did in the chapters he presented was truly extraordinary. Poverty, race, and crime are common subjects today of a lot of scholarship, but I haven't seen a lot of scholarship that can capitalize on the voices of the people involved in it and do it, and it is done in a way that is not tedious, it is not narrative, it is not pedantic, but it is humanistic. And for this, Eric gets a lot of credit. We have a lot of scholars today who can talk about the nuts and bolts of the specifics of what Eric has. But my position is we start out from a position of humanity that historians need to be reminded is the center of what we do. And for that, we owe Eric a great debt. I hand this back over to you, Howard, to introduce our next speakers.
Well, thank you very much, Lisa. You've done a wonderful job of animating what may have sounded like a somewhat dry summary, because in fact, the voices that come through this book are tremendously moving and important. And I think this was one of the subjects that the students picked up on this afternoon as we had an earlier discussion. You also mentioned how important was that he reached beyond his own scholars background to other disciplines and addressed people and drew on their resources to address his work. And that's what makes this panel especially important tonight, because we have people from very different backgrounds who have looked at these situations very, very closely with a lot of expertise and sympathy at the same time. So I'm glad to move the next part of the program to the hands of Marla Davis Bellamy, who at Temple University is directing several very important programs on public violence through a public health perspective. And at the same time, she continues to direct Philadelphia Ceasefire, an activist organization that she's been very much involved with over a number of years. So Marla, I'm tremendously interested in hear your comments and look forward to them right now.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. It's just a pleasure to hear more about Eric. And I just feel honored to be a part of this discussion, particularly given the subject matter. For me, I certainly am a Philadelphian, as Will Smith would say, born and raised. And it's been an interesting journey, to say the least. But I reflect oftentimes on a project that I was involved in while a student at Penn at the Fells Institute of Government. And at that particular time, I was working on a white paper. The school district of Philadelphia was considering eliminating kindergarten because it was not mandated by the state. And so I decided to do a paper on full day and half day kindergarten. And I interviewed a couple of hundred kindergarten teachers and first grade teachers. And we were asking questions to them about some of their observations in regards to their students. And one of the things that we found we didn't expect were their comments about their most recent students, saying that they were very aggressive, would bite and kick, and would say, they were telling us that generally young students like this were generally very nurturing. And so therefore their behaviors were troubling. And then not too long after that, we heard about the suspension rate in regards to the school district with first graders. So oftentimes when I hear about this whole surge in regards to violence, I think back to those comments, because I think that this has actually been an evolution of a lot of things that have occurred throughout our society. I've done a number of things, but certainly one of them that I'm most proud of is serving as chief of staff for the Pennsylvania Department of Health in Harrisburg. And during that time, Governor Rendell learned of a study that had been released that identified Pennsylvania with having the highest Black homicide rate in the country. I remember it like it was yesterday because he was outraged. He pulled all of his cabinet secretaries together and said, this is something that we have to address. I was physically at the meeting, and we left there feeling compelled to do something. So around the same time, we also learned through the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, Dr. Risa Louisa-Moray, that they were actually funding a project called then Chicago Ceasefire. The governor got wind of it and felt like this was something that could be replicated in Philadelphia and in Pittsburgh in particular, where there's a lot of violence going on. So the Secretary of Health and I, Dr. Calvin Johnson, we traveled to Pittsburgh first. We thought that that would be an easier lift given the number of foundations in that area. And they agreed that they thought that this was something that they should actually take a closer look at. The model talks about getting out in front of violence before it occurs, because all too often when you're calling the police in terms of 911, a tragedy has already occurred. So this was certainly a public health approach. The whole notion of community engagement was also something that we were very, very attracted to. And also given the fact that individuals that were going to be involved, these were individuals that were not forced to become a part of the program, but they are individuals that have decided that they want to do something different with their lives. So the program was implemented in Pittsburgh, and not long after that, we traveled to Philadelphia, which was home for both Dr. Johnson and I. And we met with Mayor Nutter, Commissioner Ramsey. We had a full day of assessment meetings. It was about 6 hours or so where we talked to public health professionals, philanthropists. And everyone was excited about this particular model, the Chicago model that was headed by an epidemiologist who had studied the spread of infectious diseases in Africa and was actually utilizing those same skill sets and clusters that he had developed from shootings to implement this particular project. He had actually met with the Queen Mother and David and Falaka Fatah about the work that was going on here in Philadelphia as he actually developed his own model, which is now called Cure Violence. After getting certainly a lot of support here locally in regards to implementing the program in Philadelphia, we were then kind of somewhat challenged as to where we would do this. And it was actually former Police Commissioner Ramsey who said, listen, if you can do this in the 22nd Police District and make a change there, you can replicate this model anywhere. And we were certainly excited about that in terms of, hearing his assessment. But we also know that this particular model is data-driven. So we were actually going to have to implement the model in an area that was plagued by violent crime. The next thing on our list was actually to identify a sponsor or a location, someone who was actually going to run the program. And I kind of thought that was going to be easiest, but that was not the case, unfortunately. We had a $250,000 grant that was given to us to actually identify a location in North Philadelphia, in particular in terms of the 22nd Police District. And we knocked on several doors. And Temple was one of those doors. And after a couple of tries, it was actually former Dean, Dr. Daly, who said, okay, we'll do this. I think this is something that Temple should be engaged in, given their proximity in terms of violent crime. But he said, I'll do it if you come with it. Well, I wasn't really expecting that response. I wasn't looking for a job, certainly very concerned about violence and had always been concerned about men and men's health care. And so he said, well, you come with it. And I thought about it. And I said, well, maybe this is something that can certainly contribute to the work that I had already begun. So with that, around 2011 or so, we launched this program that we now call Philadelphia Ceasefire. We kind of refer to the program as a public health approach to a public safety problem. This particular program, which is a pure violence replication site, is being replicated all over the country and all over the world. That was one of the attractions, having the opportunity to engage with people in different countries and certainly different cities across the United States who are also troubled with the increase in terms of homicides and shootings. We were certainly very successful in terms of identifying an initial team from North Philadelphia. Primarily, these are individuals who had done some prison time, who had records. But these were individuals also who had changed their lives and lifestyles and wanted to certainly have an opportunity to make an impact in the neighborhoods in which they had negatively contributed to. Fast forward, we were certainly very successful with the help of Dr. Katarina Roman that you'll hear from, because we did actually experience a 30% reduction in shootings in North Philadelphia. We then continued and replicated the model in Mastery Gratz High School. We also began replication of the model in some of our area trauma centers. We then received a grant to actually implement the program in various neighborhoods across the city in terms of looking at those who had been victimized in terms of violent crime. And then most recently, we launched what we call the Philly Hub, where we're bringing 20 to 30 organizations together every Monday at 11 a.m. And we are breaking out of our silos and doing what we can to address the needs of individuals and families and communities who have been impacted by violent crime. But some of the things that I have observed and certainly believe wholeheartedly is that poverty plays a significant issue. I always often talk about it as the haves and the have-nots. And too often we hear from our clients and from our workers as well, that they began this criminal activity, selling drugs, because they felt the need to provide for their families, to do what they could to put food on the table, to provide clothes to younger siblings, to help pay house payments. And, if you think about that, I don't think that's such a far-fetched kind of idea. In fact, most recently, you've had a number of medical schools and nursing schools that have implemented a poverty simulation for their students. And I had the opportunity to speak to one of those schools, and they told me about percentage of those medical students, after they ran out of the funding that was actually awarded to them, they decided to take up a life of crime. Because they felt as though they needed those funds to help complete their medical education, and were willing to do whatever is necessary to make that a reality and make that happen. So I have seen certainly a number of individuals who have lost their lives, certainly very tragic. I'm hearing mothers talk about burying their sons. But, you know, I am hopeful. Because I believe that ultimately we will get to the point where we need to be in terms of this city and other cities across the country if we work collaboratively together. I think, you know, Black, white, everyone, we have to work collectively together in order to address this problem. It's not just, quite frankly, from where I sit as a public health professional, not just about homicide. We think about suicide and the number of individuals that are impacted by suicide, much more than we were talking about homicide in our state and in our country. So I welcome this discussion. You know, I certainly look forward to also continuing to connect with the Urban Studies program here at Penn. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marla, for bringing us into the present and making some real connections with areas that Eric was particularly concerned about, North Philadelphia particularly, but also showing the bridge to the academic world, which makes a very good lead to our next speaker, Katarina Roman, who's professor of criminal justice at Temple, and who brings to her scholarship 2 decades of work at the Urban Institute in Washington, as well as a good deal of consulting as she's been an academic here in Philadelphia. So please, Katarina, would you take the floor? Thank you.
Sure. Hi, everybody. Can you all hear me okay? Good. Great. Well, thank you, Professor Gillette and Professor Simon and others who organized this panel discussion. It really is an honor to have a chance to discuss the work of Dr. Schneider. I want to pick up earlier where Professor Gillette ended his comments of the material world of concentrated poverty and its policing, both formally and informally, remain, and with Marla's comments about the extent of poverty in the city and its relationship to violence. There is an urgency here. I know that many of us feel it, but it doesn't always seem like policymakers feel that same urgency, or perhaps the urgency is there, but the political context of our city creates hurdles for effective policymaking around violence. So what I'd like to do with my time is just to make a few points that are relevant to Dr. Schneider's work. First, I echo his foundational belief that the social and physical environmental factors of our city foster violence. These views are similar to those of William Julius Wilson and have framed my research interests and my research agenda for years, since I was first introduced to the concepts of resource deprivation and concentrated disadvantage in 1990 while at the Urban Institute, soaking up the work of my colleagues, Ron Mincy, George Galster, Adele Harrell, and others. And when I read Schneider's book, and it's not just in the Ecology of Homicide, he discusses what he and others call the ecological structuring of behavior. And at the very beginning, on page 6 of the Ecology of Homicide, he states, where normative and institutional restraints on violence were tentative at best, homicide among low-income African Americans became a social production of the segregating city. And then he went on to say that homicides are both the product and the producers of a social ecology of violence. And when you think about it, and then built into his idea of race, space, and geography, that predictive power of social ecology, those social and environmental factors, they transcend the racial boundaries. So it's not, as you were saying, Professor Gillette, it's not, as Marvin Wolfgang was talking about, the culture of violence. And I do think we have to think a lot about, when we're talking about this ecology being a local problem, to take care, like Dr. Schneider does, in how he uses the language. So we know that it's not a racial issue. It's much more affiliated with space and place. So that gets to my point number 2. This social ecology is a local problem. So both crime problems and policing are local. So saying the problems and policing are local is relevant here in 2 ways. First, we cannot just look to other cities' explanations for homicide and gun violence. We need to better understand the dynamics of the social ecology right here in our own city, that ecology that produces violence, and our solutions, including the way we police, occurs at the local level. So something that works here, whether it be law enforcement-led solution or community-led solution, might not always work here for many reasons. And the second way I'm referring to local is that neighborhoods matter. We have a Philadelphia problem, yes, but space and place within Philadelphia matters at the neighborhood and the block level. So in thinking about this local nature of social ecology, I want to highlight that drug markets matter. Drug markets are disorganizing, they generate and attract violence, they sow the seeds to spread violence, they inhibit the generation and maintenance of pro-social networks that embody social capital and that social cohesion that holds neighborhoods together and enables that collective action. These points are addressed in detail by Dr. Schneider in his 2008 book, Smack. So drug markets in driving social isolation, they're driving out local institutions that normally would provide the sources of that interclass contact and the creation of those needed pro-social networks. Families might model conventional values, but we have to remember that this happens amidst the immediate physical environment and the chaos of drug markets. Even in those drug market neighborhoods where parents might have secure jobs or decent incomes, these might not help protect those individuals and their youth from the pressures of the street. We hear these stories. Marla knows these stories and lives these stories with her outreach workers and the participants that she sees daily. Well, in Philadelphia, I'm arguing specifically, given some research I'll tell you about right now, that social and the economic isolation in concert with drug markets is driving gun violence. Drug markets have had a large influence on the escalation of gun violence during COVID. One of my research practitioner evaluation projects in the neighborhood of Kensington has spawned a few side studies, and Nicole Johnson, who I think is one of the audience members, she's a doctoral student in our department. She's leading one of our side studies that examines whether there are any social or physical environmental factors that have been particularly salient in driving the post-COVID surge in shootings. And this study found, it's in revise and resubmit status right now at a journal. The study found that post-COVID, neighborhoods varied quite a bit in the rate of change in shootings, with the most significant association with rising violence being those neighborhoods that had drug markets. I won't go into the detail, it's not the place and time here to go into detail, but just to say that drug markets are our local problem, the neighborhood level, the block level, at the street corner level. These high violence drug market tracts are also those tracts where fatal overdose deaths are staggeringly high. 38 census tracts that have the highest rate of drug arrests make up 10% of tracts in the city, but account for 30% of the city's overdose deaths. This happens year after year after year. We can no longer look at our city's social ills as being separate problems for separate government agencies in their silos. And I know we all hear this, and what I'm saying about silos is nothing new. Marla is really good at busting silos. She told you about the hub. She's working at it at the ground level. I think we really have to keep having these conversations about busting silos and not just like us on this ideological plane. How do we move that to the ground level? Dr. Schneider was a historian, and the historical context of the city that created the social ecology of violence also created a context where drug sellers can make $60,000 in a day on the corners in Kensington. For some corners, this translates into $10, $20 million a year. I know this from my partnership with the Pennsylvania Office of the Attorney General and our work with the Bureau of Narcotics Investigation prosecutors. So my point in discussing the salience of drug markets and the high volume of drug sales as entwined with gun violence is to bring the conversation back to Professor Schneider's core thesis about the ecological structuring of behavior and the implications here for substantive change. We likely cannot rest on community organizations acting alone, government agencies acting alone. We cannot think that simply moving people into legitimate jobs will do the trick, or that moving some people out of poverty will be enough. We must come to terms with the scale of the drug market economy in Philadelphia. This means an urgent need for innovative, geographically focused efforts that combine public and private ventures and transforming the inner city landscape by making large investments in human capital and the physical infrastructure. This means clearly identifying those neighborhoods and blocks that have the most disadvantage and that they have the highest levels of poverty and are surrounded by neighborhoods of high poverty and disadvantage. These will be the same neighborhoods. These are the same neighborhoods home to the drug markets. And once identified, we need to put an array of resources together for these investments. But again, this is complicated because we have to do it in a collaborative way that helps to empower residents on those blocks to be part of the strategy. Bringing in, and not everybody wants to hear this, bringing in law, but Marla did say we need to be collaborative, bringing in law enforcement as core partners and in a manner that will increase resident trust of law enforcement and build these social networks and collective capacity. So what does this look like? Well, it's a commitment to problem-focused policing that reorients the patrol tactics to be open to a two-way informal communication between citizens and the police. And in today's world, that's key effort on transparency and a focus on effectiveness, not just efficacy of policing operations. What collective good is PPD's Operation Pinpoint if the commissioner won't reveal the 45 sets of small area boundaries of this community policing effort? Organizations could be working together with the police, simultaneously tackling the opioid epidemic and increasing the collective capacity of citizens. So specifically, neighborhoods are in need of policing and non-policing programmatic investments that increase people's feelings of efficacy about individual as well as collective action. These efforts should be coordinated and remain targeted to reduce violence in the short term, but also build up that maintenance and prevention for the long term. And with regard to policing, these collective action building efforts, which would include a component of policing for long-term investigations of these drug market organizations, would involve many collaborative partners. Yes, these efforts will surely compete with other police personnel needs, and they may be in competition with conventional policing approaches, but I believe it's our best bet given our local gun violence and drug market problem. If we have more time in the questions section, I can talk a little bit more about this Kensington initiative, its holistic approach, which is actually led by law enforcement. But I'll end my comments by reminding everyone that we have neighborhoods in our city that in the past 6 years have witnessed 150 shootings or more. Think about that, 6 years, 150 shootings. These neighborhoods are less than a half square mile in size. There has to be an urgency. And if there's not, none of us who are stakeholders have done our jobs well. Thank you.
Thank you so much for bringing us into the present and suggesting how important this set of initiatives is. And I think now we're prepared to have questions from the audience. Lisa, I think you can come back on the screen, and David is going to field the questions for any one of the panelists and for me if necessary, but you've got some real expertise here, which I hope you'll take advantage of.
Sure. My thanks to the panel, to Howard, particularly to Howard for finishing Eric's book. This is a really terrific discussion, and I look forward to continuing it with input from the audience. So I would remind our audience members to please, if you have a question, to post it in the Q&A. and we already have a few questions that have come in. Our first is about the pandemic. How do we think the pandemic has contributed to the increase of shootings in those locales that already had high levels of violence? And anyone who feels most passionate should speak first.
I can answer that just from the study that I mentioned that Nicole Johnson, a graduate student, is leading. We looked at census tracts across a period from 2017, so pre-pandemic, to the second quarter of this year, so through the summer of 2021. And what was interesting is the factors that were driving shootings pre-pandemic, which the typical factors that you hear of, the social ecological factors of concentrated disadvantage, the poverty, the incivilities and disorder, those factors that typically when you're running any type of analysis, small area analyses, have salience for driving shootings. Post-COVID, when we looked at the rate of shootings over time in the census tracts in a 2-month period, there were the most significant variable that was affecting the increase in shootings was being a census tract that had the highest level of drug arrests. So what I am arguing and saying here is there was a difference in, we still have the same core factors, the deep poverty and social isolation that's driving the gun violence from pre-pandemic, but there's something especially disorganizing and chaotic about drug markets that's attracting and generating violence. Maybe new players are coming into the market, motivated individuals who weren't involved in criminal behavior before are joining. There's more competition because maybe more people are turning to drugs. There's something happening that is specific to drug markets post-COVID that's driving the violence.
Mm-hmm. We have a number of questions about what has been referred to as the war on drugs. And so one question is, how would the targeting of urban drug markets, like you've suggested, how would that look different than the past sort of war on drugs, given that the war on drugs, many would argue, was in many ways a war on men of color?
Marla, do you want to chime in here? You worked a lot in the harm reduction approach and the holistic model of working with individuals.
Yeah, we hear a lot about the war on drugs in regards to the impact that it had in regards to the African American community, in particular, the males of our community. And when you look at oftentimes the sentencing, for instance, issues in regards to cocaine and crack cocaine versus powder cocaine, and we, over the years, I just think that there has been increased frustration, in regards to what's happening to the men of our community. And I think that there has probably been more discussion and more open dialogue in regards to the war on drugs and how that has impacted our community. Moving forward, there has been over the years, most recent years, a number of individuals who have been formerly incarcerated that are now coming home. And certainly one of the challenges with that, and I haven't seen most recent numbers in regards to what the percentages of our city's population in terms of returning citizens or those with criminal records. But again, these are individuals who need opportunities in regards to employment opportunities. And so therefore, if we're not providing them the same level of opportunities, education, trades kind of training, and they don't become successful in regards to making money and certainly providing for their families, we see recidivism. all over again. And so this is something that I don't think we talk enough about in regards to opportunities that our employers are providing for our communities. I think that certainly the private sector has a role to play as the public sector. But our local businesses, small businesses, as well as large businesses need to make a commitment in regards to providing opportunities for many of these individuals who otherwise may not have any other choice but to begin selling drugs again, just to provide in terms of their community. So a lot of work needs to be done. There needs to be more engagement and discussion with our private sector in regards to the challenges that we're having as it relates to workforce and workforce development.
Mhm. Lisa, do you want to comment?
I was going to comment on the earlier question about the
Terrific.
pandemic and the situation. I'm in New York, and we've seen a surprising rise in the murder rate. New York had, I'm sure everyone knows, one of the lowest murder rates in the nation, which we were very proud of, and that seems to be somewhat eroding. I don't want to get away from Eric's work, but I feel compelled to say that the effects of the pandemic, it's way too early to know what the effects of the pandemic will be. But certainly the emotional effects, I think most psychologists and psychiatrists and social workers have said that the increased sense of isolation has contributed to a lot of problems in just normal behavior. You go to your local bodega to buy something, you don't like the way the guy talks to you, and you pull out a weapon. Now, I come from a state, I'm not familiar with the gun laws of Pennsylvania, although I do remember many, many years ago when Hillary Clinton was running for president, she was attacked on a radio interview for saying it was okay for people to go hunting. And somehow they thought that that made her into a gun advocate, but which kind of is a sort of, New York has a very anti-gun position, but it was the emotional impact. And I think, I go back to Eric, and I think that if Eric were here, I know Janet's in the audience, and I hope Janet will forgive me for forecasting what I think Eric's reaction would have been. But I think Eric would have identified COVID's isolation and sense of underlying fear as a contributing factor to everything. The unemployment situation got worse, but there's a lot of strange things going on with the pandemic. And I think that what Katarina and Marla have said, I think you're going to have challenges in adding the pandemic to your job and your work to say, how does this figure in? I have a house in a very remote place in Connecticut where everything is very peaceful, and a gay couple wound up, one of them killed the other because they got crazy from the isolation. You thought, how could this possibly happen? So there is yet this other element to bring in.
The example that you just gave is one of domestic violence.
Domestic violence, yes.
And
yes.
there's and Eric has a whole chapter in his book that we haven't discussed yet on women who murder and who are murdered. And it's a discussion about, he separates out the discussion of violence on the streets and violence among peers with domestic violence. I wonder if anybody wants to or can summarize that chapter and talk a little bit about domestic violence today. Howard, maybe you can talk a little bit about what Eric argues in that chapter.
Well, I didn't make a major point of it in my remarks, but it fits in very much with the larger insecurities that were underlying conditions that people shared in confined space. Basically, if you think of the police as basically containing the borders and people being confined to a landscape and a world in which resources are limited and nerves are frayed. I mean, again, I go back to the COVID. I think the COVID way in which it unnerves people just adds to the possibility of anger and striking out. And what really struck me as formidable in the chapter that Eric wrote about was how not just men carried knives in the period before guns became pervasive, but women carried knives too, or at least would take access to knives in their own home if they felt absolutely threatened, as many of them did, by outbursts of anger or jealousy or just sometimes things that couldn't even be explained. So it's this close quarters, and also the question of identity, and Eric refers to it more than once, for men, masculinity, and defending one's masculinity in a world where all sorts of things are eroding that sense of masculinity, the status of a job, the status of being a leader, being all the things that you expect if you have education and opportunity. That's a volatile situation. And I found the chapter quite stunning. And I would have liked to have seen more of it even extended out. But he draws on the existing criminal justice literature in terms of setting the stage. And then he tells rather powerful stories, including two men who killed their spouses, one black, one white, and how they were treated differently by the criminal justice system. That in itself is not terribly surprising, but as I mentioned to the students today, what was surprising was how much detail Eric was able to bring out of trial transcripts to tell their stories. So in one way, they have a kind of agency we see them acting and why they act. At the same time, it is a tragedy in the end when one or the other spouse gets killed.
Yeah. May I just add to that the characters I had noted in writing about this, Lieutenant Howard Brock and his wife May, and Grover Richards and his wife Doris became the agents for telling a story. And one of the things I remember saying, I think I said it to Howard, maybe I said it at the seminar, is that I could see this on a screen. I could see these lives being brought to the larger public because, like a Greek tragedy, it's not a black and white story. There are lots of different things. I mean, you have unjustified violence, but you have to understand the subtleties that Eric conveyed when he went through that testimony. And I remember thinking how extraordinary it was. I've been through testimony myself, and it's very tedious to go through that testimony. And when you watch TV dramas, you don't see that interior view in the same way Eric presented it. The whole issue, by the way, I will say that New York has had a persistent, and many of the large black churches in New York City have the heads of those churches have very vehemently opposed the right to carry guns because they've always felt, and that was some politicians had felt too, that if you have the gun in your home or your hand, you're likely to commit a crime in a moment of passion. Whereas if you don't have the gun and you get really angry, but you got to go home or go somewhere to get the gun, by the time you do that, you may calm down and it may mitigate things. The problems with domestic violence. My sister was an assistant district attorney in Manhattan for many years. One of the problems she faced as an ADA she dealt with a lot of domestic violence, was that once the case came to the legal system, women usually backed out of the case for all the reasons that we're probably all familiar with, which I am optimistic that as we go into the 21st century, that is beginning to change thanks to all of the people who are aiding the legal system with women. But Eric's chapter on this, I think, is really groundbreaking.
I just want to add in thinking about Eric's work, how when he talked about the women who had committed murders, there's that backdrop of isolation and not having the social networks, not expecting and knowing that the police aren't your friends, right? You're not going to call the police because it's not going to be the same when a police officer comes to the door and you're a Black woman versus a white woman, right? There's a different types of limited social networks that we read about in Eric's work and William Julian Wilson's work, that in these communities that are surrounded by poverty, there's very limited pro-social networks where you might have the informal support. So then women could be getting support somewhere else and not ending up in frustration, killing their husbands who have abused them. I thinking about it that way as well is really, really interesting when you connect it back to that isolation and the lack of networks and the lack of the expectation that the police will be there.
Thank you all. We have another question about the role of the police. There has been a long history of scholarship that critiques the institution of the police and pointed to it as state violence, upholding white supremacy, protecting capital. And this has experienced renewed interest in recent years. Alex Vitale's The End of Policing is one example. This audience member would like to hear the panelists' thoughts on this. Why do the police exist as collaborators here as part of the solution?
I'll just take that because that might be in response to me discussing the drug market neighborhoods. And I want to make clear that these neighborhoods, if you've been in Kensington in some of these corners, I'm not talking about 3 or 4 young Black men selling a couple times a week. I'm talking about very organized, structured organizations that have different cultures throughout it, where it's not even known who the highest person is, that who's pulling the strings. These are multi-tiered organizations that some of them are billion-dollar enterprises. So to be able to dismantle an operation like that, of which there are many in Kensington, that is when you need the police investigators who have the resources and the skill and the connections across the federal government and the state government and the local government to do long-term investigations that are going to bring intelligence together that will help get you to that top level organization. But these are the types of efforts that you have a policing part of it, but then the residents of the neighborhood may know that some of these operations are going on, that the police are really trying to do something on these particular blocks, and they're working with residents and organizations in those communities simultaneously to make sure that if the top level drug kingpins are arrested and prosecuted, who have been implicated in dozens of shootings, if they're implicated, then social services come in and the police are working with other government and local resources to restore and heal the community. And those efforts are really driven by what the residents want. So there are many successes in the country of these types of collaborative initiatives that are not based on surveillance of the average citizen, that are specifically designed to take down an organization that's been responsible for dozens of shootings a year.
Yeah.
Anyone else, Lisa?
Yeah, I wanted to say one very brief thing. This is an elephant in the room topic. It's a big topic, and a lot of my research had been done on the origins of policing systems, although my focus was on riots, not necessarily on murder. I started off with crime, but shifted in the course of it. It's an interesting fact. The American system was built on the English one, and the English system, and it surprises a lot of people when I talk about this. The English system was based on the fact that the police were to prevent crime, not catch the criminals afterwards, but take measures to keep society ordered. There are problems with modern policing systems, but I cannot imagine a society without a policing systems, because we are not necessarily a very orderly place to operate in. And as Katarina just said very beautifully, we have to take down the big problems. The new mayor of New York City is a former policeman. And that is, I am very interested in charting what he is going to do to control crime in the city, because I can say that cities with high crime rates will fail. If your crime rate goes out of control for whatever reason, you can't necessarily blame the police. You can blame the police if there's too much crime. You can blame the police for a lot of things, but you have to control it. So it's a complex subject, but I'd like to believe that reform of the police, and I think implicit in a lot of Eric's work was the notion that things may go wrong, but they are correctable, and that we have to be optimistic. And in many ways, Eric was the most optimistic person, when he said, let's keep this on the schedule. And when he wrote this book and tried to finish it, he saw that the subject that was engaged in this heart of the book was something that was going to continue after his death. And we are the proof today that these are enduring. And I'm glad that today's session was devoted to continuing the conversation that Eric started.
I did just also want to add that, certainly we have a lot of discussion about police, and I just don't think that we can certainly do away with our police departments. They are an integral part in terms of public safety. The model that we're replicating, the hub, is actually a police model that we learned about in Chelsea, Massachusetts. And I had the opportunity to talk to them on the phone for about a year, and you would have never thought that these individuals were policemen, because now they understand the importance of prevention and the importance of getting out in front. But as we kind of consider and have these open dialogues and discussion about racial bias and challenges as relates to police force, something that I always tell people is that no matter what profession you're in, you take that bias with you, whether you're an educator, whether you're a doctor, whether you're a lawyer, we take our biases with us. And this is something that we need to grapple with. Certainly there are challenges, and we, would be the first to say that there are definitely challenges. But we've got to learn to overcome them because police are definitely an integral part of this whole notion of public safety.
I will say one thing about the police supervision at this point. It was heartening to me that when an effort to revive a more powerful and more effective civilian review board came forth in the last several years, that they referred back to what happened in 1958. They knew what went wrong. They knew there were no teeth in that review system. And there were circumstances created that. And I think they're trying very hard to correct those mistakes of some 50 years ago. And one would hope that a institution like that would give confidence both to the general public and to the police that there are adjudicatable circumstances and that there are ways to correct mistakes that are sometimes institutionalized or compounded by decisions over time, but they can be correctable. And that's going back to Lisa's point and to Eric's. He was certainly not impressed by what happened in 1958. And he threw this back at me when I suggested that Camden perhaps needed, after totally reorganizing its police, needed a review board. And he said, they didn't work in Philadelphia, but I think they can, and I think this is going to be a big test for the future in Philadelphia.
Our time is almost up. I'm going to take the moderator's privilege of asking the last question. Was there? I think we are all in awe of Eric's work. I think this is a terrific book. My thanks again to Howard to bring it to completion. I wonder, because these are panelists that have read the book very closely, none more so than Howard, was there anything that Eric argued in his findings that you found particularly surprising, or that struck you as sort of, again, simply that surprised you?
I will say that I just want to say that I read the book and thought to myself, this is why we have to read outside of our discipline, right? I often say that criminologists, right, we go to criminology conferences and we're all talking to each other and we're all using the same terms and the same concepts and the same measures in our studies. And that, Dr. Schneider talked a lot about masculinity and these aspects of human agency and the interaction of masculinity and males. In criminology, we don't often talk about that. Sociologists do a little bit, but I really thought about the intersection, how he brought the intersection of urban, what we know about urban policy and just in general, how the history of cities and how that translates to the social ecology, but then brought in individualized aspects of human agency and masculinity that aren't often taken into account when we think about crime prevention programs and violence prevention programs. So all I'll say is, this is why we need collaborative strategies and multiple stakeholders across different types of government agencies, behavioral health, public health, urban planners, researchers in criminology, epidemiologists coming together, everyone, residents at the forefront and thinking how to create these programs that have theories of change that match the complexity of the issue.
Just to echo what Katarina said, is that if you look at the footnotes of this book, you'll see a wide range of disciplines drawn on, certainly in criminology, certainly history. But in history, it's a very distinct voice. And that's what Lisa brought in her comments, that it's almost impossible to miss the humanity and the agency, and also the odds against the people whose accounts Eric tells. And I think this reminds anyone who works from a statistical base, as Wolfgang did, and most criminologists do. You've got to have a base, but there's always some vital human experience going on that can be built on. And it seems to me that's what Marla's working on, by bringing so many people together and treating this as a public health issue. People who are suffering, whatever kind of illness we want to call it, need help. And that's what I think we've heard talk about in terms of the contemporary efforts, is to coordinate that help and not just take it piecemeal, as we often do through a criminal justice system or through the city council appropriations for money for urban renewal or whatever might be happening. And it's a reminder that we all should keep talking to one another. And for me, I've been just wonderfully uplifted by hearing from people outside of my background and discipline, and hearing what you're doing right now, as well as being reinforced by my longtime association with Lisa in terms of the good work that she's doing.
One of the things I did just want to mention that I thought really touched me was the leadership in terms of the African-American community. The mention of Congressman Gray and certainly Sam Evans and certainly Fataz. that is something that I thought or reflect on as critically important. We need leadership that are going to certainly express their concern, but also understand the importance of galvanizing support across many sectors. And that's one of the things that I certainly feel as though is missing in terms of leadership around this particular issue. So I certainly appreciated the mention of Black leadership in terms of the community in Philadelphia.
Lisa?
I can't, it's very hard for me to add anything to all the wonderful things said. All I want to say is that I think this has been a wonderful tribute to Eric via his book. And one of the things that I remember saying to Eric, you have all this administrative responsibility. How could you possibly still be teaching? And he said, but that's what keeps me going. And I think, you know, the last note here is that that's what keeps us going, is voices like Eric. I'm so thankful that I was on this panel. When Howard asked me to do this, I thought, oh, well, you know, I don't know, but this has been a wonderful discussion, and I'm glad it's recorded and that people will be able to hear it. And I hope that many in the audience are those students whom, if Eric were here, he would have reached out to work with to try to help them understand what's a central problem in American society today. So thank you for including me in this discussion, and thanks to everybody who made this discussion so successful.
Thank you. And on behalf of my co-director, Elaine Simon, I want to thank Howard and Marla and Katarina and Lisa for your terrific comments. I want to thank the audience for their patience and for their terrific questions and for joining us tonight. This is another terrific annual lecture, and I'm thrilled that we got to honor Eric Schneider in this particular way. If he's listening somewhere, I'm sure that he's smiling, or he has a bunch of arguments that that he wants to with which he wants to retort. So at any rate, thank you everyone, and have a terrific night.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you. Good night.